Welcome back to part 2 of clauses. In our first video, we defined a clause as one complete subject plus one complete predicate. We then defined a simple sentence as one independent clause, and a compound sentence as two independent clauses joined by a fanboys. In this video, we'll get into complex sentences and the idea of dependent clauses. Let's return to the idea of the swimming pool and write another sentence. As we've been doing, let's look at the clauses. Okay, clause 1. We got sick. The complete subject is just one word, same as a simple subject. Got sick, our complete predicate. We'll look at clause 2 in a second, but let's start here. We got sick. By itself, it floats. There's an independent clause. Now you might be thinking, hey, this is starting to sound like a compound sentence, but look, no fanboys. When is not a fanboys. We'll come back to that. So clause 2, it's about they. What did they do? They drove through the mountains. Now, if clause 2 were just they drove through the mountains, it would be independent and we'd be good. But because when is not a fanboys, it doesn't work like that. When, because it's not a fanboys, has to be part of one of the clauses. And if it's part of this second clause, it's no longer independent because when they drove through the mountains is not a complete sentence. It's not a complete idea. We need more information. When they drove through the mountains, what? Your brain is asking. So that's a dependent clause, and the word when made it dependent. So now we have a clause that's going to drown if we leave it alone in the deep end. We don't want to take it to the shallow side of the pool because we want it as part of our sentence. We're just going to have to give it a great flotation device and keep it in the deep end. And what better flotation device than the independent clause that it's right next to? This probably sounds silly, but it's the best way I know to explain what happens next. Look, the first clause takes over the second one. The complete predicate of the first clause shoots into the second one so that the entire second clause has a double underline. This is a complex sentence. We have one independent clause, and then a non-fanboys that instead of standing between two clauses to connect them, becomes part of one clause and makes it dependent. When is just one of many, many non-fanboys words. There are many more non-fanboys than there are fanboys. So the most helpful thing is to memorize the 7 fanboys so that you can spot a non-fanboys that's trying to do what a fanboys does but can't, and therefore has to be part of one of the clauses. Notice that the second clause, the dependent clause, still has a simple subject and a simple predicate, but we double underline the whole thing to show that it's attached to the first clause. It's not its own idea. Let's look at another complex sentence to reinforce what we've learned, because it can be tricky. First, see if you can spot the non-fanboys word trying to be a fanboys, trying to connect two clauses. Do you see it? The non-fanboys is after. So if we look before after, we have a clause. The teacher dismissed us. That's an independent clause because it could be a sentence all by itself. It floats. After, because it's not a fanboys, can't stand between the two clauses. It has to be part of one of them. And clearly it's going to join the second clause. So, after class ended does not form a sentence by itself. Therefore, the first clause takes it over. All that after class ended does is tell you more about dismissed us. It tells you when the teacher did the dismissing. Now what if I took after away and left the second clause by itself? Class ended. We're back to an independent clause. It really is just that non-fanboys word that messes everything up. What used to be a dependent clause is now a simple sentence on its own. And then we could turn this into part of a compound sentence by adding a fanboys. The bell rang, clause 1, and fanboys, class ended. Both the bell rang and class ended are independent because there's a fanboys in between them and they can be sentences by themselves. So we're back to a compound sentence. It's all about the words in between. Do you have a fanboys or a non-fanboys or a clause all by itself? Now what I've not been telling you is that these non-fanboys words have their own name. They're called subordinating conjunctions, and the nickname for them is awubis because the letters of this word help you remember a lot of the different subordinating conjunctions. Now, just like coordinating conjunctions, subordinating conjunctions pop up in sentences with multiple clauses. The key difference is that they can't stand between two independent clauses. Instead, all of these awubis words join one clause or the other, and whichever clause gets the non-fanboys becomes dependent. At the end of the day, it's all about the conjunctions. If you can spot a fanboys between two clauses, boom, compound sentence. If you can spot an awubis trying to stand between two clauses, boom, you found a complex sentence. So, one more time, a clause is a complete subject and a complete predicate, and a simple sentence is just one independent clause by itself. Compound and complex are the categories we use to talk about sentences with more than one clause, and a compound sentence has two independent clauses that can swim on their own, be sentences on their own, joined by a fanboys, by a coordinating conjunction. A complex sentence is different and trickier. You've got one independent clause and one dependent clause that would drown unless the first one took it over. What makes the dependent clause dependent is a non-fanboys conjunction, an awubis conjunction, a subordinating conjunction. Some complex sentences will start with a dependent clause and end with an independent clause, but you can still follow the same rules. So, here's a simple sentence at the top of the screen, one complete subject, one complete predicate, sentence by itself. We'll add another clause onto this clause to form a compound sentence. Compound because there's a fanboys joining the first clause to the second one. So both of those clauses are independent. They could be sentences on their own. And finally, we'll change the fanboys out for an awubis, which becomes part of the second clause instead of standing between the two clauses. This sentence is complex because the first clause is independent and the second one is dependent. The independent clause takes over the dependent clause to keep it afloat.